Today's postcard is from the historic borough of Tewkesbury in the county of Gloucestershire. Now, Julie, I know you're a little bit nervous because you've never done telly before, have you?
No.
This is your very first experience.
That's correct.
And you're here to tell us about the story of Tewkesbury. So we'll take it nice and easy by asking you the name. It's an unusual name, Tewkesbury. Where did it come from?
Well, Russell, it's believed to have come from the name Theok, and Theok was reputed to be a hermit who lived along the river, and that became Tewkesbury and then Tewkesbury.
All right. And of course, a bury normally meant a fortified place as well.
That's right, that's right.
So he was an old hermit, probably with a little fortified bit
That's
around
exactly
him.
so.
You have a very important meeting point here of two rivers, don't you?
We do. This is where the River Avon runs down from Stratford and joins the River Severn running down from Wales, and then the two go down to the Bristol Channel. So this is at the very confluence of the Avon and the Severn. Hence that makes Tewkesbury a very important crossing point in medieval times.
So that was really why it was in such a strategic position.
It was a very important town at the time, and that led to obviously also things like it becoming an important market town. And in fact in Gloucestershire the three big towns at those times were Tewkesbury, Gloucester and Cirencester. They were the three big markets.
When you come to Tewkesbury though, the overriding factor has to be the Abbey, doesn't it?
Oh, indeed so. I mean, the Abbey is by far the biggest part of Tewkesbury, and of course, although the water is very important to Tewkesbury, one of the other reasons why Tewkesbury is such a popular town and has always been a town since very early medieval times, and we're talking 12th century really, was the Abbey, which was a monastery. And of course, many of the buildings around the Abbey, although it wouldn't be so obvious today, were actually there because of the Abbey, either for feeding the monks or for the water wheel or any such thing like that. And in fact, it's said that in early times the Abbey was actually very rich. Tewkesbury was a very rich place, and that the monks lived very well, and that in fact they were told off by the Bishop of Worcester for being gluttonous and debauched. So there you go.
I'd have done well there then.
Yes.
And all that lovely Tewkesbury mustard.
Oh, indeed. So the Tewkesbury mustard, yes, we've got the Tewkesbury mustard, which of course sadly is no longer made here, but can still be purchased, and that's a spicy mustard in itself, a bit like I suspect the monks were.
For whom doth the bell toll? Probably for John Hart, because here's a wee postcard moment for you. Just walking around Tewkesbury Abbey here in the graveyard, we've come across his headstone, and it's John Hart, the sixth descendant from the poet Shakespeare, and he died at the age of 45. And here in Tewkesbury, there's quite a few descendants of Shakespeare, if the name Hart corresponds, because there were boat makers and chair makers here in this ancient borough in Gloucestershire, and he was in fact a chair maker. Now, William Shakespeare died childless, probably because he was writing too many plays and sonnets, didn't have time. But his sister did, and it's actually the descendancy, the lineage comes from Shakespeare's sister, and that's where we get Mr. John Hart, now deceased, here in the grounds of Tewkesbury Abbey. As we look down the town, I'm struck by the fact that Tewkesbury seems to go on and on and on. There's one big main street with the most glorious half-timbered buildings down one side, and then it seems to go off into two different directions. It forks. The town's shaped like a Y, isn't it?
It is indeed. It's very much shaped like a Y, and that's really because of the rivers and the floodplains. Not only have we got the Avon and the Severn, but on the other side of Tewkesbury we've got something called the Swillgate, which again flows into the Severn. But those three rivers really have constrained development. So in fact the medieval core of Tewkesbury hasn't actually changed very much.
And that's where we are now, isn't it?
We're right slap bang in the middle of medieval Tewkesbury.
Now I know that one of your personal passions is what you can see between us. Isn't it?
That's
Tell us
right.
about this. It is a bit different and not what you expect.
No. One of the big things about Tewkesbury is its hidden places, really. And in Tewkesbury, there used to be 90 alleyways or courts.
90?
90. There are now about 30, many of which are still open to the public, but they were about 60 feet in those days, going back to the old imperial measures, and this is in fact about 54 feet. And of course the reason why these are here is because the building land was so constrained that in fact what happened was that these very densely populated places grew up along the sides of the main streets at right angles, and in fact they were actually slums in those days.
It's not very often you see this little bit of architecture anymore, because you can see that this top half of the building is out, so that the ground floor here is protected. The reason why, and I'm sure you know already, is that up there they would chuck out all their rubbish, their filth and their swill. Ugh, all the horrid stuff would come from that top window, be thrown out. So of course, if you're here, you'll be protected by the overhang. Nowadays, of course, the bottom has been brought out so that it's a straight line. But what happened to all of this filth? It might be called Lily's Alley, but I don't think it smelt like a lily down here, because all of the slops that were thrown out of the top would gather here and would race down, because it was all sloping down to the river Swillgate. Now I did actually check that to see if it was Swill Gates, because all the rubbish will be swilled down to the river. Maybe that's how it got its name. But the interesting thing here is that you still have the original overhang, and I could imagine that although it smells pretty nice now, in the old days it must have absolutely stank. And by the way, it's called Lily's Alley because there was an old lady called Lily who lived here, and she used to make clay pipes, and that's why that house there is called Clay Pipes. Tell us about this chapel, because you seem to have made a bit of a thing about it here in Tewkesbury.
That's right. It was restored by the Borough Council in the mid-1970s, having fallen into disrepair, as indeed many of the properties in Tewkesbury had done, and in many medieval towns at that time. And a lot of properties around that time were lucky really to escape demolition, particularly in the 60s and early 70s. And this was restored very much as it would have been. It was an old Baptist chapel, dating, we think, the actual building is much earlier, but the baptistry really started in about the mid-1600s, about 1650s. It stopped being a practising Baptist chapel in about 1805, but of course during that period there were lots of changes to kings and the sort of persecution of non-conformist faith, and the reason we think why the Baptist chapel was actually down an alley is because it was fairly secret, and of course they would come and have their services down here. Very much the Baptists were believers in the family home. They didn't like all the pretence of the great abbeys and churches of the time, so the non-conformist religions, particularly the Baptists, felt very much that it would be in a home, and in fact the Baptist chapel was originally a family home.
Interesting.
The baptistry is still there, and it's said that because of the persecutions, that very often the actual baptisms took place at night. And there is a rumour that there's actually a tunnel coming under here to get people out if they were in danger.
You have the most glorious, I mean, looks like miles of half-timber buildings. And was it you who told me, whilst we're just having a cup of tea, that they were thinking of pulling that down in the 60s?
Yes, indeed so. Yes,
so glad. Why did they not, for a change?
Well, what happened was many of the medieval buildings in the 60s were in a terrible state. People didn't really bother about them then, as I'm sure you appreciate. Conservation's much more to the fore now. And what happened in the 60s was that the cottages were bought out and were due for demolition, actually were applied for to be demolished, and the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, known as SPAB, stepped in and actually gave money to have the buildings restored.
Oh, thank goodness for SPAB.
Indeed.
I've never heard of them before, but thank you, SPAB. What else about Tewkesbury would appeal to you, so it would appeal to our postcard friends to come and pay you a visit?
Well, there are lots of literary connections in Tewkesbury as well. We've got the Shakespeare connections, which you've mentioned yourself. We've also got Dickens connections, and we find literary, particularly a lot of people like to follow the literary connections. The hop pole was mentioned in Dickens' Pickwick Papers. And we also believe we've got the old curiosity shop as well in Tewkesbury. Was apparently the setting for that particular book. And we've also got a connection with a man called John Moore, who was a journalist, who was very much an environmentalist and loved Tewkesbury, wrote lots of books about Tewkesbury. So there's a big literary connection as
and
well.
Mrs. Craig.
Mrs. Craig, our Victorian Mrs. Craig, who I think actually only wrote one book.
John Halifax?
John Halifax, gentleman.
Yes, we hadn't heard of that before.
No.
So I don't want you to think how clever
No.
I am.
Well,
because
of course I'm sure you are.
Well, in some areas, but not with Mrs. Craig. Tewkesbury Cross. There stands a memorial to the men of Tewkesbury who died in the Great War, but centuries earlier, during the Wars of the Roses, that was also the place where people were tried and sentenced to death. And all along the high street here in Tewkesbury, they were executed. And in some instances, their heads were put on spikes as a lesson to all other people, victims of war.